Okay, so I want to introduce Sarita Eisenberg. Sarita is here today to speak about speaking, learning to speak, an everyday miracle. By the age of 5, children have learned over 2,000 words and are producing sentences of 13 words in length. Shomrei member Sarita Eisenberg, professor of Speech-Language Pathology at Montclair State University, will discuss how children are able to do this. Really interesting, really fascinating. Thanks, Sarita, for coming.
Okay, so before I start blathering, and this is going to be hard because when I teach, I'm busy moving all over the place, but I've told I have to stay in this area. So I'm going to actually hold on to the chair because that will remind me that I have to stay put. Okay, so before I start to talk, I do want to get a sense of what people think happens when children learn language. What's your view of the process and how kids are able to do that? So any thoughts about that?
I think they pick it up from their family and from their surroundings. I don't know, but I assume they pick it up from before they even are out. If they're, in you, then when they come out, they already have some preconceived things going on there.
Okay, so things for me to think about, yes.
So in Music Together, we talk about music development, but we correlate it with language development. It's that serve and return. So when a baby goes ba ba ba, we say, oh, do you want a bottle? We turn it into a whole sentence and we acknowledge their babble. We acknowledge it as communication, and then they begin to pick up the actual words as they develop further. That's how I see it.
So it's a little bit need-oriented. So when I had, Brian with me all of the time, he barely spoke, and then the doctor got really worried. But then when he got examined more closely, they found out it wasn't him, it was me. I was doing too much for him, that's what I was told. And so he wasn't speaking. So when I dropped him off at Shomrei's preschool, that's when he spoke his first sentence. And he knew language very well. He actually pronounced words beautifully. It just was need-oriented. So he said, call my mommy, bring my mommy back. I want my mommy. And he never spoke a word before that, really. So I think it's need-oriented as well.
Anyone else want to?
I think that we're genetically hardwired to speak, and that it's something that happens because we're programmed to do that. And the exception to the rule is when it doesn't happen, and there's something that goes wrong there. But I think that it's sort of a natural path.
And I agree. I think it's two paths. First is in the brain. I guess, obviously, it's in the family. Chomsky's view, there's a grammar that's somehow genetically prone to, and then you've got to develop the muscles to do it. It takes a while.
If you miss the opportunity to have language at the crucial period, then you may not have that opportunity again.
Right, that's referred to as a critical period, yeah.
And they seem to know the mother's language from another language. They can pick up two languages.
Yes. Okay, so there's some threads here that I'm hearing. One is about the role that talking to kids, right? That basically our role as the people that the kids hear, that plays a role in learning. We also have a sort of minority. Maybe they're a little bit primed because we have a linguist daughter, and obviously has talked to me over the years about what's happening in the brain, hardwiring in the brain. So that's also something. This is the nature, nurture kind of sort of false dichotomy that people have to set up. I'll just, as a spoiler alert, I'll say that both of those things do need to happen. We've had some comments about how we could potentially, as parents, do something wrong that might lead to problems. Okay, so I do want to address that. I will, again, spoiler alert, I'll tell you that's a myth. Okay? Thank you.
That's why I came
And I didn't come with it. I'm a terrible joke teller, but I have a wonderful joke about that, which I'll talk about a bit later on. So I came equipped with handouts, which are some cartoons that I want us to look at, because these cartoons really get at some conceptions that people have about the acquisition process. So I will use them to partly talk about. So I want to actually start with the idea of hardwiring, that we are in fact programmed, right, to learn language, okay? And Charles talked about the language piece and also the speech piece, and those are two really different aspects of learning. Language is something that we know in our brain. It's really abstract stuff. It's a body of knowledge in our brain, and we use that knowledge in order to communicate to other people. So there's a reason, that's probably a good reason why it developed. I'm not a historical linguist, so I'm not going to get too detailed about that, but it does serve a purpose. Learning it isn't just something that we learn just for the sake of it. So there's that, and then there's speech, and speech is motoric, right? So there is some control over the muscles. Of course, there's innervation to that, and so there's that piece as well. And these are really separate. We often think about language as something that is spoken, but in fact, there are people who are not able to speak. There are children who are not able to speak for one at all, right? They don't have that the speech motor capacity for that, and yet that doesn't mean that they're unable to learn language, because they are still able to get that body of knowledge, which language is, in their heads, and we might then help them to express that in a different way. Okay? It could be through sign, it could be through what's called alternative communication, where we have a communication device, which might be a board where they point to pictures. Ultimately, someone like Stephen Hawking has this whole mechanical system, which is just amazing, where there actually were whole phrases and sentences programmed into that, but he also could select out the beginning sounds, or he did it by the alphabet, and at some point it was a sort of a smart device that would guess at what he was going to say, because that shortens it up. If you tried to talk to somebody by spelling out one letter over a time, that would be really time-consuming, and then your listener was sitting there, and by the time you get to the end of what you wanted to say, they would have forgotten what you said at the beginning, so that really is laborious. But there are other modalities of communication, and speech is one modality form of communication. It's also important to know that it's one modality for taking in, right, language, for hearing language, for experiencing language. The most common one, obviously, through the ears, but there are many children who learn by watching signs, who get exposed to a sign language, and they're perfectly able to learn language as well. So I do want to set that up in terms of what language is, and that language and speech are not the same thing. Language and communication aren't the same thing too. Communication is something that we do with language. Okay? Language allows us to communicate. We have other ways of communicating. You can communicate with gesture, and young children will do that. Right? They start by communicating with gesture. Okay? When they don't have any words, they continue to use gesture even as they learn words. And adults use gesture too. Sometimes adults communicate just with gesture, and by gesture we think about what we do with our hands and our fingers, but it's also our facial expressions. That's also gestural. We can also communicate with just our voice, okay? And sometimes as adults, what we gesture and how we use our voice contradicts what the words are saying. That's what satire is all about, okay? And so that's part of communication as well. Okay, so I'm going to focus on the language piece, which I'll roughly decide as learning a body of words, right? And then being able to put them together and combine them in various ways, right? Combine those constituents to make meaning, right? So we learn language allows us to encode meaning. So it is definitely hardwired in. There's no question about that. When people talk about the nature-nurture debate, and so there are people who want to just act like nature has nothing to do with it. It does. We are hardwired in. And I'll talk a bit about some of the capacities that infants have right at the get-go. Okay? But it's also very important to say that you have to hear language. If you never heard language, if you never were exposed to it, you wouldn't learn language. So the top I think the top cartoon gets to that, right? We have this couple pushing a baby carriage. I'll describe it because we have people here who want to be able to hear it. We have these people pushing a baby carriage and two other people commenting, your little Korean orphan, she's adorable. Are you learning to speak the language? You're learning to speak Korean. And the new parents say, no, why? And then one of the other people says, well, what are you going to do when she starts to talk? Okay, this idea that this is a Korean kid, so therefore, what does this kid know in her head? She knows Korean, but no, we do learn the language, the ambient language. We learn the language that we are exposed to. Okay, so you do have to be exposed to it, and being exposed to a particular language obviously affects us. We do things differently with what we do, with the way we communicate. The language we learn is influenced by the language or languages that we're exposed to. So that's important. Okay, so in terms of this hardwiring, it's really amazing what the capacities that infants have. In terms of taking in, I'm going to focus on the speech, that oral, A-U-R-A-L input, and it's there right from the beginning. And one thing to keep in mind is that infants hear differently; they listen differently than we listen. As adults who already know a language, at least one language, we're listening for meaningful elements, right? We're listening for those words. And then we see how they're put together. So we're already listening for these strings of sounds that have meaning. Okay? And we tune out the details of the phonetic string. That would be distracting for us. Well, infants don't know the words. And what they are hearing and what they are listening for are changes in this acoustic stream that they're hearing, and different types of sounds within the acoustic stream. And that's not distracting to them at all. Okay? So the sounds that we say are of different kinds. So we have sounds like P, right? We've got air coming up, and we create a closure, and we block off that airstream, and for a very brief time, there's silence. There's a moment of silence in that acoustic stream, and then the air builds up behind that, it gets released in a burst, and you see the static. So if you actually looked, I guess I could have brought you as part of your handout a visual, a spectrographic visual of the speech signal, but they hear the silence and they have this spike of static that they hear, right? So that P sound is going to be like that. Then we have sounds like S and Sh, which are all static, right? But they're bigger static, right? So they're longer segments of static. We have vowels. Vowels are made by vibrating our vocal folds. Okay? Some of that is done at the same time. Well, mostly that's what. So you have these parts of this acoustic stream that are just about that vocal fold vibration. That sounds a different way. So putting that together, children are listening for those what we call consonant type sounds, right? That involve the silences, the noise, either a burst of noise or a longer term white noise component, and then they hear the vowel part, right, which is just the vibration. Okay? And that's really, we look for that. We're really primed to hear what we might think of as a consonant-vowel combination, and then we break it off, and we are waiting for the next consonant-vowel combination. Okay? So that kind of capability helps children to segment the speech stream, so it doesn't, people who describe listening to another language that they don't know, and it sounds like this continuous thing without any breaks. But that's not what speech sounds like to infants. They actually are able to break it up into parts. Right, so that's an ability that they're born with. They can do that. And of course, that's very, very important, because if they couldn't do that, they wouldn't be able to separate what are going to be potentially meaningful elements. They also can hear certain differences, certain distinctions between speech sounds. So P and B. P is a sound that has that silence and then the burst. B also has vocal fold vibration. I'm going to obviously simplify that. Okay? So that's called voiceless. P is voiceless, B is voiced. And infants can hear that difference. They can make that distinction. So that is something they don't have to learn. They are born being able to tell the difference between voiced and voiceless sounds. S, z are also voiced and voiceless, so they can actually make that distinction for staticky sounds as well. So that's one kind of sound.
The band's visit turns on, the play and the movie, the band's visit, I don't know if anyone saw it, but it turns on the fact that the listener can't distinguish between the P and petah tikva and a B, right? So
actually, it's a little bit more nuanced than that.
Okay.
Lots of languages have P's and B's, and it turns out that the P and B in every language is not the same. When we talk about P's and B's, we think in terms of categories of sound. So across languages, we will identify this category of sound called a P, and we'll identify a category of sound called a B.
Right.
But in terms of the acoustics, what fits into a P in one language might be part of the B in another language and vice versa. So it actually hinges on the fact that in Arabic, as well as in some other languages, the boundary between P and B is different. Yeah, so it's actually, it's very nuanced. Okay, so kids are listening, that's one kind of thing that they can hear. Kids can hear the difference between sounds like p and f, right? They can hear that kind of difference between a stop and an explosion versus a longer staticky segment. That's another kind of distinction that kids can make early on. A distinction that kids cannot make right away is between f and th. Okay, those are really, really close acoustically. Not coincidentally, th is fairly common in languages of the world, but doesn't occur in all languages, but occurs in very few languages. And it's because the distinction between and another sound like has to be learned. It isn't something that infants are born being able to tell the difference. So the kind of sounds that that occur very frequently across languages absolutely has to do with the kind of distinctions that kids can make early on. So this ability then to sort of see these types of sounds and group them together into consonant vowel units, that's going to be very important. The ability to make distinctions between certain kinds of sounds so that you can start to tell the difference. These are very, very important abilities that children bring to the table that enable them to break up and deal with this incoming stream. Okay? And ultimately what they have to do is they have to take those phonetic segments, phonetic is just about the acoustics, right? Those acoustic phonetic segments, and they have to start connecting them to concepts that they have learned. That's what actually words are all about, right? Words are some consistent phonetic stream, right? That encodes some specific concept, right? That is actually in our head. We might think of a word like dog coding that thing, dog, but actually it's our concept of dog that it's coding. So, so these kids have those inborn abilities. Okay? So then think about the influence of the environment and hearing language. Somewhere between 6 and 9 months, children really are being influenced a lot. It's really noticeable. How children are being influenced by the language that they are exposed to. And then who talked about, someone made a comment about what they, Adrian, I think it might have been, about the fact that kids hear language in utero. They're not going to hear the sounds, but they are going to hear a rhythm, right? So they actually are primed to hear certain kinds of rhythm patterns. It's not horribly detrimental if they're adopted out to a different language, but absolutely. People are studying that and looking at the actual language learning environment, if you will, that's in utero. Yeah, and I don't remember exactly when in utero the auditory system develops enough for kids to hear the outside. Do you know? But it's certainly it's at least a few weeks before it's at least a few months, before they're born. So they do get that input. On the other end. So around 6 to 9 months, you really start to see the influence of the ambient language because children stop responding to certain acoustic differences. They continue to respond to the ones that are necessary for the language that they are learning, and they're busy tuning out the other ones. So what are some examples of that? So in some languages, some of the vowels are called nasal vowels. French has both oral and nasal vowels. Oral vowels, just the airflow just goes through our oral cavity, okay? And that has a certain way that it looks, if you look at a spectrum. And then we have nasal vowels that actually we open up the port that connects our oral cavity, our nasal cavity, and airflow goes through the nasal cavity, and it's a very different sound. So we have and okay? I don't do that well because I don't speak French, I don't speak a language with nasal vowels. So initially kids can hear that difference. That's another one of those distinctions that kids can hear, that somewhere between 6 and 9 months, English learning children don't notice that anymore. French learning children will keep noticing it. Okay? It's because for them, it's going to be a crucial difference. Some of the Scandinavian languages have a distinction between shorter vowels and longer vowels. So kids can hear that difference. We're talking about milliseconds, but they can hear that difference, but English learning children don't need to know that. That is not something that helps distinguish words, whether or not you have a longer or shorter vowel. And so they tune it out after a while. And that becomes important because where do they have to go? They have to reach a point where they're not distracted by every detail in the acoustic stream, but can start to think and perceive categories of sounds. The experiments for this to try and see what infants and young children can hear, the difference they can hear, are really ingenious. I want to share one kind of experience with you. One kind of experiment that is made is based on the fact that if things don't change, you habituate to it, right? You start to tune out. If you just, right? If you're hearing the same thing over and over and over and over again, you tune it out. We know that, right? And suddenly when something changes, suddenly you notice that sound. So infants do that. And so there are experiments where they are exposed to a certain acoustic stream, and then a change is made in it. And they're given like a pacifier, which is connected to a device that can record. And when they habituate, when they're hearing the same thing, right, the sucking rate goes down, right? So you get them, right, this very slow, calm, stable sucking rate. And then you change the acoustics, and you see, does the sucking rate change? If they notice a difference, their sucking rate will go up. It will spike for a bit. And then if you keep playing the same thing, again, it will go back, right? So these are really incredibly ingenious experiments. So that's how you can tell. The earliest experiments have been done around 1 month, right? So maybe not quite from birth, or my guess is, of course, right? My guess is it's not developed in 1 month, but then they've also looked at 6-month-old, 9 months old, and they can really see how these distinctions are falling by the wayside. Kids don't respond to them anymore because they don't need them for their language.
Are there a certain number of sounds per language that, you know, in English there are 100 sounds that kids hear? Are there a sort of, does each language have a average number of sounds?
It's very, very variable. English, I think, has 26 consonants, if I'm not mistaken, and there are languages that have many fewer than that. There are languages that have more. English has, I think, 16 vowels. There are languages, I know for vowels, there are languages that only have 3. Yeah. Now, there are also other parameters that we don't use in language. So, for example, in languages that are called tone languages, like Chinese, Japanese, Korean, another thing that they do with whole syllables is they change it's not really an intonation pattern, but you can have a pattern where your pitch, they change your pitch pattern where it rises. It starts at one level, it rises. That's a tone, a possible tone. You start at one level and it drops. Then they have low pitch, high pitch, a middle pitch, stable. So there's, I think there's up to possible, there's 7 different possible tone patterns. And that isn't really, you can think about it as part of the vowel, but really it's a whole word phenomenon. And that's something also that English learning children will tune out, you know, because we don't need that. And in fact, if we did pay attention to that, we're an intonation language, so we vary our pitch across whole utterances. And you can't do both. You can either know a word-by-word change in pitch pattern that is used to help you distinguish between two different words. It actually changes meaning, or you can get intonation. You can't get, they compete. Those two systems compete. There is a limit on the available consonants and the number of available vowels, but how many each language has is quite different. Yeah. And there are certain kinds of sounds that are not used. So raspberries, which I cannot make, that's the vibration. There's no language that has that as a sound. On the other hand, clicks are an important part of some languages. That might seem like so non-speechy, but clicks are, and I don't do those very well either. I tried to learn these things. Those are something that is mobilized for language. Yeah. So it's kind of interesting. So not all the possible sounds that we can make get mobilized to become speech sounds. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So some other things. So somewhere around 6 to 9 months is when you really see children really very clearly being influenced by the ambient language that they're learning, and not being distracted anymore by aspects of the acoustic input that is not going to be important for their language. So then another thing that kids have to do is they have to take those phonetic strings that they are identifying. Another ability that babies have is pattern recognition, right? So they start to calculate in their brain acoustic patterns that occur a lot. Okay? So say a P with a particular vowel, right? With a particular vowel, they might notice that one's occurring a lot. They're going to start to pick those up and notice those and really sort of hold those in their brain. So that's going to be also very important, that ability to recognize patterns and co-occurrences, what consonants and vowels co-occur. Ultimately, there will be consonants also that co-occur together, and so they're going to start to notice that as well. And so they end up having these stable phonetic strings that they're noticing, and then around 9 months, or actually somewhere between, again, 6 and 9 months, kids they learn something they learn something very, very important, and that is that the noises that are being directed at them are meaningful. That there's a reason people make those noises, not just to make them, okay? This is something that is learned, that there's probably some hardwiring that allows them also to realize this, but that is really something very, very important. And some kids learn it later. When I give ages, it's always approximate. There's a huge variability. But that becomes really, really important, because once you have figured out that someone is trying to convey something to you, that changes how you are approaching, right? You're listening. It changes your listening. So now you're going to listen and try and figure out the meaning. So in all this time, where they're figuring all that out about the acoustic stream, they're also experiencing the real world, right? And the experience of various concepts, right? Seeing a dog, being fed, right? Some of them are thing experiences, others are event experiences. They're learning about those things, and that means that in their head, they have these ideas, right? And they're going to start to attach those. That this phonetic string, oh, I hear that when I'm experiencing this event, or when I'm seeing that thing. And they're going to put those things together. Okay? It's called mapping a sound stream onto a concept that we have in our head. And of course, what is that? That's what words are. Right? That's what words are. It's very laborious initially. I mean, it takes a lot before a child will make that initial connection. And so initially we see a very, very slow, the number of words, and of course we index this by what they say. We see very, very slow, right, that children will start to say something, and they'll say a consistent phonetic string when they mean something. and they can be, you know, obviously we don't moms and dads all hope that that will be mama and dada. But it isn't always. And so that's the second cartoon. Love this cartoon. So here we have a father feeding his kid and saying, Marvin, do you have? Marvin, say dada. Oh, actually, you don't have it. There's plenty more. Yeah. Marvin, say dada. Right? Then in the next one, we have the mother is changing the baby and says, can you say mama? Right? And then the third one is the dad, and the baby is on, Marvin, is on his, oh, that's my son's name, so I love this. He has the baby, Marvin is on his back, and say dada. Then the next one again is the mom playing with Marvin and saying, say mama. And then you have the father trying to do something. He's hammering, and of course, what does he do? He hammers his thumb, and he curses. And what do we see in the next one? We see the baby repeating what he has just said. Okay? So this tells us something very, very important. Okay? What the parents are doing is very common. They're trying to teach their kid language, but it turns out that, yeah, that kids need to be exposed, but kids are not passive little receptacles. They make active decisions. Kids choose the words that they are going to learn. There's no question about it. And they are looking for the kinds of concepts that they are going to look to encode are things that are meaningful to them, that involve changeable aspects of their environment, that are things that they can manipulate. Kids hear the word floor a lot, right? Parents are always talking about things dropping on the floor, but young children, that is not an early vocabulary word, even though they hear it a lot. Okay? Now, mama and dada will often be in early vocabulary because this is a person who, it's not because they're there all the time. It's because they're there and then they're not there and then they come back. It's that dynamic change, that changiness. The fact that this is somebody who's there some of the time, and then, right? If they were there all the time, it'd be like floor. And you might feel that way, right? That, oh, I just like the floor to my kid.
Yeah.
Right? In which case they won't learn mama.
So it's not because they need something and mama gets it? Or?
Okay. So that's, I mean, mama is doing various things. Mama and dada are doing various things. They are meeting the kids' needs as well. Yeah.
The first meaningful word I always found was no. You say yes, and he says no.
No is an early word for many, many children. Yes is not. Children don't need to indicate yes. They put their affirmation, but no for some kids.
Open your mouth, and he says
yeah. But it's not necessarily the first word or even in the first 10 words, but it's often within the first 50 words. John, you have
So I was wondering why mama and dada and no sound so similar in every language, like, you know, ima in Hebrew. Is it because those are the easiest sounds to make?
So those are some very easy. Those are some very easy sounds. Easy in that these are distinctions that kids can early on, and from a motor speech perspective, m is easy to make. Da is fairly easy to make. So, and then notice that they're also just consonant and vowel. They're not clusters. They're not combinations. Right? They're fairly simple. Now the ima one is interesting because language is a language that has lots and lots of single syllable words. That's because in the adult language, what adults say, we do a lot of clustering. So we, the longest possible word, a syllable in English is a vowel, and then in front of that can be up to 3 consonants, and after it can be up to 4 consonants. There are many, many languages that only allow syllables to be consonant and vowel, right? So they don't do that clustering. But English, because it has all these complicated syllables, a lot of our words are single syllable. Obviously not all of them, but a lot of them. And our children, that's what English learning children need to do, is produce single syllable words, or what are called reduplicated, where ma, it's the same syllable. Languages, if children who are learning Japanese is, each syllable is much simpler. They do use tones to distinguish between words, but they also distinguish, they have more multisyllabic words that are very common. And so Japanese learning children will actually start from day one producing more multisyllabic words. So there's those differences. So yeah, there's an easierness there, and there's some universal easierness, but there's also some characteristics that are easy in one language and hard in another, and vice versa. Yeah. Okay, so kids are making choices about the words that they're going to learn, and there are certain words that are going to be words that you see fairly common across children who are living in a particular culture, right? It's also very cultural because it does certainly also have to do with what they hear. That is going to be important, but they're going to be making those choices, and so it may be. This is like, watch that you're being taped, watch that you're being listened to. Mm-hmm. It may be that something that becomes really salient and sort of the kid thinks, oh, this is important for me to replicate. That may not be what you choose. So take a look at the one with the parrot. Right, we have this parrot talking to this man. I just can't shake the feeling that I don't really understand language as an abstract concept, but I'm merely imitating syllables as a trained response. I love that. So yeah, that is what parrots do. Parrots have this amazing ability to replicate pretty accurately a phonetic string that they cannot break up, that they don't understand. Okay? And that's not what kids are doing. Okay? Kids are very variable in this as well as in many things. There are some children that imitate a lot. You say something and they'll say it back. You don't have to say. Mm-hmm. They'll just do that. They hear something and they repeat it. Okay? Other children don't do that at all, or do that very, very little. So there are high imitators and low imitators, and they all learn language. So it isn't necessary for children to imitate in order for children to learn language. I do want to mention at this point, in terms of this ability to replicate chunks, that when we think about the steps of language acquisition, we think about kids who don't have any words. Then they learn a single word and another word, and finally they build up a set of words. And we usually think about somewhere between 50 and 100 words. And at that point, which is somewhere around 18 to 24 months, children start to combine words. They have 2-word utterances, and then they add another word, so they have 3-word utterances, and then they add more things, and they start to combine longer things that sound more sentence-like, right? So we think about children going through those stages, and that's the most common path. But there are also children who learn in a more holistic way, where they do replicate whole chunks. So think about the reciting the alphabet phenomena of elemental P, right? Where kids don't know that that's, right? They don't know that that's separate elements. And there are other kids like that who learn chunks. It may be a two-word thing like thank you, what at? That's a chunk. It's a single word for some children. There are kids who actually replicate and learn much, much larger chunks. And they don't seem to parse things into individual words nearly as early. And so they may initially look like they're delayed, but then they figure it out and they do parse. In fact, you'll hear what sounds like jargon, and then a word, right? And so they start to do that. They kind of create themselves a slot to put real words in. So there are some alternative paths. So Lou was holding up his watch, because I don't have a watch. I can't use my cell phone. That's how I usually figure out time. So I wanted to make sure that I had time for questions.
Plenty of time.
Yeah. But I'll take Naz as having asked the question about this need idea. Okay. So let's see if I can tell the joke that I tell to my students, but of course I have it on a PowerPoint slide, but I didn't replicate it here. So Johnny was 4 years old, and his parents were really, really worried about him because he wasn't talking. He wasn't saying words and sentences and things like that. They brought him to one expert after another, and nobody could really figure out what was going on with him. And one day at dinner, the family is sitting out to dinner, and Johnny says, "Mom, can you please pass the salt?" Johnny, you spoke, you said a whole sentence. How come you've never done that before? And Johnny replies, "You never left out the salt before." So this is called the needs hypothesis. And it does not explain language acquisition. And I actually present that, and that's one of the things I present on a course on language disorder, when I talk about why do some children have language disorder. So what happens with young children is if you have a child who, and that's your only child, this is middle class moms, by the way. You're like trying to anticipate every need they have. That's a fairly common pattern. And the kids learn language, right? Again, language is something that you learn in your head, and how do you communicate and whether you communicate, that's a choice that you're making. So if the child is hungry and you've already fed them before they realized they were hungry, then that's something that they don't need to communicate. It doesn't mean that they're not learning language, right? There are also cultures in which parents do not talk to their children until their children start to combine words. Because the idea in that culture is that why would you talk to somebody who doesn't understand you? Because people do peg, even though it's not quite the same, people do peg talking as a way of figuring out how much people understand. So those kids learn also, okay? So when we have kids who have older siblings, and in the clinic we often have parents who will come in, and parents, anything a parent can feel, particularly a middle class parent can feel guilty about, they will feel guilty about, and they'll say, I know that my kid is not, has a problem because his older brother is always talking for him. Of course, what the older brother is doing is being very linguistically proficient, and is figuring out what his younger brother is trying to say and telling that to other people. So that actually, meeting a kid's needs does not prevent them from learning language. We actually know that having needs met is really important for all kinds of aspects of development. Children who are neglected, they still learn language. You have to really, you pretty much have to lock a kid in a closet so that they don't hear language for input, to really prevent a child from learning language, lack of input, right? But it does influence milestones. So we can certainly talk to kids. We know, we use this information in therapy all the time. We know that there are ways that you can modify how you talk to children, which might help them to learn certain things faster. Okay? So that's certainly the case, but that doesn't mean that you are either making it so that they won't learn language and otherwise they wouldn't, or that you're preventing them from learning. Linda?
Okay, I just had this image of the kid in the closet. Is there a critical moment I know this sounds weird, but is there a critical moment if the child is not exposed to language for whatever reason that there's any permanent damage, or they'll just pick up later on?
So there is a phenomenon called the critical period. It's not just for language, it's for other things.
Yeah.
This was discovered back in the 1950s for visual perception, where a guy whose last name begins with a psychologist whose last name begins with H, and I can't remember what his name was, he did study 4 little cats, and he blindfolded them. And for some period of time, and then he removed the blindfold, and they were still able to see, but they couldn't see. Their perception was totally messed up. I have to watch my language, I'm being taped. Their perception was really, their visual perception was really messed up. So that is something that we know is true for language as well. That's one of the reasons why early intervention is so important. We know that children have to hear language before they're 2. On the other hand, the critical period isn't quite as rigid as we thought. So there is some flexibility, but if children truly didn't hear language, And there have been some unfortunate children who have been kept from input. But although the ones I think that occur naturally were discovered when they were 9, 10, so who knows how long it went on for. We have the wild boy who somehow was in the forest. We have Jeannie, who was locked into a closet by her mom. I think her mom had schizophrenia. That was to protect the kid, but the kid really got very little input and all that. So that was severe. And Jeannie was discovered when she was 13. She had a lot of therapy. She did learn some language, but it was very rote. She didn't really learn how to generate sentences and all that. So there is a critical period. And part of the reason for the critical period is that the exposure to language changes your brain. So when we're born, our brains are not complete. Our brains are still rapidly developing for the first 2 years of life. That needs to happen, otherwise we'd be like bulldogs. I don't know if you know that bulldogs was especially, my father was with them. They were bred and they have these huge heads, and even as puppies they have huge heads, and they cannot give birth naturally. They have to have cesareans. Yeah, this is a totally ridiculous breed that anybody decided was a good idea. So if our brains were so fully developed, we'd be like bulldogs, and we would not be. Everybody would die in childbirth, if they counted, because it took a long time for people to know how to do cesareans. To keep our brains smaller, they're not fully developed, and there's a lot more development that has to happen within the first 2 years of life. And the brain doesn't develop in a vacuum. Even in utero, brain development is being influenced by the environment. Okay, so nutrition, mom's nutrition, probably the fact that they're hearing stuff. All of that is influencing their brain development, and after they're born, you think about the areas of the brain that are going to be mobilized for language. Those are being developed as children are hearing language. And there are some points in development where the brain has very sudden changes in its architecture. One of those is when children start to combine words. There's an open question now. Is it a change in brain organization that allows that to happen? More people are thinking no, it's actually, because this is the beginning of true grammar, that achieving that milestone actually changes how your brain is organized. Yeah, John?
I think I'm always fascinated by how language can change our perception of the world completely. And I had one example when our youngest, Elliot, was little. He heard, whenever we would say meadowlands, he heard metal lands, as if it's made of metal, right? So this didn't come out for years. I think he was like 7 or 8 before he saw a sign or something that said meadowlands. He's like, what's that? And I said, meadowlands. And he said, oh, I thought it was metal. And I said, why? And he organized it, and he said he heard that and it makes sense, but then he saw bridges and oil refineries.
Well,
and
it's made of metal, is what he said.
Right.
It's made of metal.
Then later, what's interesting is that it was later I was driving, and he said he'd never seen the grasses before, all the swampy stuff. He said, I never saw that before. Is that why it's called meadowlands? Like, the fact that he misinterpreted this word made that grass invisible to him. It was not important.
Right. So this is part of the active process where children bring what they know to the process of figuring out the meaning that they're hearing. And, that's why at some point, children start to acquire vocabulary at an incredible rapid rate because they have learned how to make the connection between segments of speech and concepts. And they've also learned more about what that relationship can look like, but they're definitely influenced by what they already know. And that's what the last cartoon here, the one on the bottom right, is, where you have this little girl with an angel thing on her head. Mommy said to behave, so I'm being as have as I can, right? So there, behave, she segmented that, right, into 2 words based on her experience with other things that followed be, and we do that all the time. I had another cartoon that I didn't put, and there's a ladder. There's this person, this man falling off the ladder. There's 2 chickens standing right at the bottom, and then there's a 3rd chicken over here, and the 3rd chicken is going the sky is falling, the sky is falling. And the 2 other chickens are going, no way, we're not falling for that again. Right? So they have totally misperceived what their other chicken is saying. Right? I just love it. Yeah, I just love it. Isn't that that's wonderful? Let me give you another example about how we parse and how we hear things through our experience. I mentioned before that the children are really, they're listening for syllables that start with a consonant and then have a vowel, and then when they hear another consonant, they're going to initially assume that that starts another word. Now, obviously, for a language like English, you've got to overcome your initial ideas about what constitutes a word, because we have a lot of words in English that have consonants at the end after the vowel, right? So if we didn't get away from that idea, we wouldn't be able to learn those words. But I remember in high school, there were this group of guys who started going around saying words like nunion. Because if you say an onion in speech, what we do is an onion. You actually take that and you take the consonant that ends a word and you attach it. That's what we do. And so they started doing that. They started saying words that started with vowels, and they began them with an. I don't know why they particularly picked up on an. I guess an, and then because that comes up a lot. But again, there are plenty of kids who do that, who make that kind of an error because they are they're parsing, right? They're figuring out what the speech stream is based on what they already know, and then you have to learn that that doesn't always apply. And so that is something that has to be learned.
Well, you were talking about the brain development and speech, and the way it was taught to me was that neural pathways are like hiking trails in the woods. So it's basically use it or lose it. So that's one reason why the non-native language sounds fall away, is because the babies are trying to learn what they need to know, and they can't learn everything. And if you don't use it, those neural pathways get diverted to something that they are going to use.
So 2 things like that. One is that it turns out that earlier brain organization has many, many, many connections that do get parsed off. So we might think about how maybe isn't brain organization more and more elaboration of the brains and connections, but actually there is a pruning that happens. So that is something that happens. There was something else, of course, that I wanted to say. This happens to me all the time. Tell me what you said again.
So about neural pathways and hiking trails and non-native language sounds falling away.
The second point will probably come back
Okay,
to me
sorry.
later on tonight, and then I'll have to.
Yeah, email me, yes.
I find this all very fascinating, especially as my hearing deteriorates. You go through the process in reverse. You begin to hear certain sounds that clump together, and you really have to exercise some kind of a distinction capacity to be able to break them apart again. But it's clear evidence of what you're talking about, because I'm hearing almost as if I'm a child.
We see that also with acquired language deficits from strokes or even from traumatic brain injury, that when we look at the pattern of what gets preserved, it often mirrors what's easier, right? What's more common across languages and what you were earlier. So there is some of that. Yep.
And to jump on that point, also,
Jamie's
I'm an
an
audiologist, so I always say to my patients all the time, they come with very mild to moderate hearing losses, and they're shocked that they have this hearing loss, and I'm talking to them about, what they're perceiving. And because we develop such great language, and because our brains are wired up for language, we're able to plug in those missing pieces based on visual cues, based on contextual cues, and based on what we know. So a lot of times they say, well, it sounds like my kids are mumbling, and it's really, they're able to put those pieces together because of that base of language. And I say to them, you're designed to do this. You learn language by listening to your parents and looking at their lips and putting in those missing pieces. And you've done that your whole life, and now that your ears are starting to change, you're using those innate, abilities again to try to get you through. So that's why people are, pushing off getting help, because they don't even realize it because of the way that their auditory system and their brain is able to compensate for their loss of hearing.
You want to follow
One
up?
sentence
Yeah.
to add to that, the first time I had a hearing aid, it was raining outside. And it was the first time in a decade that I'd heard the sweet sound of spring rain.
Yeah, you forget.
It erased completely.
But you will have to, when people are aided, and I think it's one reason why people get aided and then they decide not to wear them, is you have to relearn aspects of perception, because again, if you are noticing all of these sounds, that's distracting, right? And one of the things that kids learn very, very early, right? That's why what they can tell the difference, why it gets paired out, is that we don't get distracted by unnecessary details. So when you want to hear the rain, you want to hear the rain. But if you're trying to listen to somebody talk, you don't want to be distracted by the rain. So relearning that figure ground, how, what to foreground and how to put stuff into the background is something that can be really difficult for people who have lost their hearing and become aided.
Especially the longer you wait. Especially the longer you wait to
The
get
longer you wait, yeah. We encourage, even when you don't have a severe hearing loss, to go and get yourself aided, and then if you need over time, you can get aids the aids can be adjusted for you. But yeah, if you wait, it can be harder to learn those perceptual pieces.
So, question about acquisition of two languages as a child at the same time. So I have nephews who grew up in Israel. Their parents are English speaking. They spoke English at home. They spoke Hebrew outside the home, and naturally they're completely fluent in both languages, almost without an accent in English. But I wonder how much of I wonder if there have been studies done on two different variables on that. So one is in their case, they were speaking English at home and Hebrew outside the home. So I imagine that allowed them sort of a way to almost socially distinguish between those languages. But if you have one parent who's speaking Spanish and one who's speaking English, or one who's speaking Hebrew, and that's one variable, and the other is where one language is, say, English, or say French and Spanish, two Romance languages, versus a tonal, a tonic language, and a Indo-European language. Have there been studies to see to what extent full language acquisition, is it slower where the languages are very different, or slower where they're closer? Does it matter whether both parents are speaking different languages or speaking the same? I mean, have they done studies on those kinds of?
Yes, there are a lot of studies.
Yeah.
I've read many studies on this. It isn't my area,
Yeah,
but one thing we know is it doesn't harm children to be exposed to two languages, and that's very important to keep in mind, because there was a time where people were being told, make sure that your child learns one language, and so that means keep it to one language in your home, and then your kid will be young enough when they get out and they can learn the second language. Now we know that isn't a good route. Even for kids who have difficulty learning language, who have language disorder, we want them to be exposed to the two languages really right away, because they have to function in communities that use those languages, so it becomes really important. So in terms of advantages and disadvantages, there are some milestones, if you think about milestones, that children who are learning two languages might be a little later on. But then there are also some aspects of language that children learning two languages get quicker. So we do see the whole pairing away kind of thing, that is sometimes later. And there is some mixing, and the closer the language, the kids have to really figure out what goes with this language, what goes with that. There's some hypothesis that, in fact, if at home you have one parent consistently using one language and one consistently using the other, that maybe that might be easier. Quite frankly, it's hypothetical, we just don't know. But there are some things that children who are learning two language have an advantage over. So there's a principle when children are learning words. They have some constraints that they start with. One constraint is that if that phonetic string gets attached to something whole. Okay, so dog, right? That's a whole. You don't learn tail, right? They don't start to think, oh, it must be the tail, even though the tail is wagging. They figure that phonetic string is dog. And sometimes, if they're using a word for an entire event, it's too broad. They actually will use words for entire events, right? Because they have this idea that these phonetic streams capture wholes. And another very strong constraint is if you already have a word for something and you hear something, you hear a new phonetic string, you're going to assume that it isn't going to be another word for the same thing, okay? Because there should be one word for one referent, right? And they stick with that for a while. So typical kids, some of them are still constrained by that by age 3 years of age. You know, ultimately they have to learn that, oh, I'm hearing another word, there's a reason that I'm using it, and maybe it isn't your synonym, they have to start accepting that. But children who are learning 2 languages figure that out really, really young, because they are hearing, you know, dog, perro, they figure out, oh, there actually are 2 ways of talking about the same thing. If they have, and that's why some people have hypothesized that if it's the mommy way of saying dog and the daddy way of saying perro, maybe they can figure that out. I don't decide that that's hypothesis. There have been a lot of studies about that. Looking at children who are learning 2 languages simultaneously, there's what's called sequential bilinguals. Most of the studies that have looked at the difference are looking at children who learn the 2nd language later than age 2. In many studies, that is still going to be considered a simultaneous bilingual because they're so young. I think people are starting to say, no, that's still sequential, not simultaneous. Is there a difference?
I wanted to ask about kids that have like speech impediments, like lisps, and you know they hear, but they say th. So what is it just a cross in the brain that's not?
So there's 2 possibilities when you hear children who are not accurate in how they produce speech sounds relative to what the ambient language, what the target would be. One is that, is it possible that they don't hear the distinction, right? So I said that, you know, f versus th, and even s versus th is very, very hard. Th is very hard to perceive, right? And so it is possible there are some children where it's a perception thing. If you don't hear it, you don't know that it's distinct, then you're not going to try and make that sound in its own unique way.
But th is more common.
But for many other kids, it's a speech motor control issue. Okay, so s is not easy. S is not an easy sound to make. Your tongue, it can be either up or down, but it has to be fairly close to the front of your mouth, right behind your front teeth, or right below the bottom teeth. Either way, for a long time people thought it had to be the tip up, but it doesn't. But you have to not completely close off the sound. But you just have to have a little bit of an opening, because if you have too big of an opening, you won't get all the static. So that's hard if you think about trying to create a narrowing without creating a closing. At that place, that's going to be hard. So that's why some kids actually say t instead of s, because they completely close, they don't get the narrowing. But it turns out that creating that narrowing for the tongue being between your teeth is easier than doing it behind the teeth. So from that perspective, even though th is a harder thing to hear, you know, there's different reasons. No one knows exactly for any particular kid why they make certain errors and how that came about historically. But there's sometimes things that are harder to perceive are actually easier to produce, and so there's going to be some tension.
But do you need to catch that early? Because I know a 15-year-old that still speaks.
So, you know, there are newscasters that still speak that way. It's or they do what's called a post-dental. They don't completely say th, but they'll say, you know, like that. It's not very detrimental to understandability. So to me, it's not high on my priority. If it's a parent you're concerned about it, then sure. There are 2-year-old children who are able to make s, and there are lots of older people who can't. So that's one of the sounds that's very, very valuable.
So it's learned.
Yeah. Fern?
Yeah, well, just to kind of, and I was born this way, and struggled with it my whole life. I can hear words, I can't get them out of my mouth. I went through private speech therapy since I was 3 years old for a lot of years. So to that point, the disconnect I have is I hear what you're saying. I hear the word up here. Every time I try to get it out of my mouth, I can't get it out. And I really had to train myself how to say a lot of words. And there's still words that someone will It drives me crazy. You know, I'll say a word wrong, and they'll just keep saying it over and over again. Like, no, you're supposed to say it this way, and I'll keep, and it's like, I get it, I hear it, I just can't get it out that way.
So there's this another cartoon I'll tell you about, because I remember this cartoon, you know, it's so vivid in my mind, and I cannot find it. I love this cartoon, and there's two people, and they're looking at this animal, and one of them points to the animal and says, "New." And the other one thinks it's a cow and says, "No, moo." And this goes through. Of course, it's a new, which is, what's the other name for a new?
Wildebeest.
The wildebeest, right. So I just love this. This goes on for the whole thing, and of course, finally, the one who's trying to get the other one to say moo gives up. So I love that. Yeah. So yes. So just repeating and saying it louder certainly doesn't help. So again, there's different reasons why some people know words. That is, you know them in your head, but you're not able to say them. Could be, again, a speech motor control issue, an articulatory issue, could be that. Another one is it could be a what we call word finding, word retrieval issue. I have some difficulties with this myself. It runs in my family, where you have to access a word from your mental dictionary. So for some people, they don't do that as quickly, right? For other people, they don't do it as accurately. And one thing to know about the way that your mental dictionary is organized is it's not a word here and a word here and a word here and a word here. Words are organized into networks of interlocking meaning and interlocking similarities in terms of the way they sound. And so sometimes you want to say one word, but you say another word, and it could be a word that means something similar. Actually, be an antonym, because we also create networks that way. Or it could be a word that sounds similar, right? And so that creates some difficulty. I have a great deal of difficulty in learning a second language. I can analyze, I can learn about the grammar of other languages. I can talk about them. I have a great deal of difficulty in learning a second language because I cannot recall vocabulary. So, yeah. So there's more than one possibility for why you might have that difficulty. Yeah. Yes.
Can you talk about stuttering? Like there's people who are, as they begin to speak, they have a really hard stutter where they can't push the word out. Like they know what they want to say, they know the word.
So that's also not in my area of expertise. It's not language. It's a speech motor control issue.
Okay.
And there are many children who are disfluent early on, and then, quote unquote, they outgrow it. And then there's a group of kids that won't outgrow it. And the same is true for kids who seem to be delayed initially with language, that there's a lot of kids, about 20% of 2-year-old children are going to potentially be labeled as delayed. Now you know that 20% of the population doesn't have a serious problem. By the time their children are 5, that pares down to around 7% of kids. So there are kids who initially have some difficulty, and their speech motor control is just taking a bit longer to develop. And so there are strategies to help them when we ask parents not to put pressure on them to talk. That's not because that caused the stuttering, but it's because we know that if you take the pressure off, then they won't develop negative reactions to the disfluency. There are also people who later on develop it. So, you know, all of these are complex, you know, speech motor control, language, these are complex stuff for us to learn and develop, and lots of things can go wrong. And some people just take longer. The trajectory of developing that skill or body of knowledge takes longer, but they'll ultimately get there. And others, there's a permanent issue where they really have something, and we don't even know why. That's a very big area of research is to explore. Why is it that somebody have this disfluency as something that is inherently part of their articulatory system? Yeah, not just articulatory, it's all the speech systems.
So I'm curious to know about the hardwiring of the brain and language acquisition, and talking about there are certain milestones when kids have a certain number of words in their vocabulary. I'm curious to know, when you look broadly from all the different languages, do they find that between 6 and 9 months, in all the different languages, kids have about 50 to 100 words? Is that consistent?
So it's a hard question to answer. There are similarities. The issue becomes the fact that languages are so different. So English is a language where we learn a word, we learn words, and then we learn to put those words together. And we have to do it in a particular word order. So that's a very important thing. So the word combining is a very important milestone for English learning children. For children learning Italian, Italian is a highly inflected language, right? So that children learn to put what they're called morphemes or inflections. They attach those to words. And so, whereas English learning children, their entry into grammar is putting words together, two words together in a consistent order. For Italian children, their entry into grammar may be attaching one of these inflections. And so, because of that, you're going to see some differences across languages. And then the kind of vocabulary that culturally gets sent to children is also going to vary quite a bit. This isn't inherent to the language, it's more the culture. But in our culture, and again, it's our middle class culture, which is every culture in the United States is not the same. But in our middle class culture, we expose children to a lot of names for things. We're very thing oriented. And so children learn, and words for things are easier because things stick around. In the language, in a culture in Korea, I think it's true in Japan too. See, I have all these isolated facts about other languages and culture in my head. Those are languages that emphasize verbs more. Now, in every language of the world, nouns are the most common kind of word. Okay? But still, in those languages, part of the early vocabulary will be verbs. Earlier than kids learning English, but verbs are inherently more abstract. So it's going to take those kids a bit longer. So it's really hard to answer that question because there is this variety in what they are actually learning in terms of the ambient language and culture. But yes, there are commonalities. And let me just give you one other example, and that is Inuit. They have, this calls into question what is a sentence, because the way that they form what we would do with sentences combining multiple words and even some inflections, which we don't have very much in English, they have sort of a base thought, and then they attach things. And it's actually, it's called an agglutinating language. They actually create these meaning units that are words. They're long words. And that's how they express what we would express in sentences. So how to answer your question, there can't be any word combination, milestone for a language like that. Yeah, so it really is, it would depend on that. Anybody who hasn't asked much? John, I'll get to you, and let me go to Linda, and then I'll get to John.
I'm just wondering if I'm thinking about what Fern was saying, when kids are developing languages and when adults are developing languages, there are certain things that they have strengths with and difficulties with. When somebody thinks they're being helpful in correcting you, is there, number one, is there a better way for someone who's hearing something to respond in a more polite way or a more supportive way? And is there a way that we can teach our kids or as adults to respond to it? Because people mean well, I think, but they're not being helpful.
So one of the things that we use in therapy, and this is based on what adults do with children, is a phenomenon called recasting, where after we have heard someone say something that isn't correct, we say it in the target way. And we can do this with sounds, we can do it with word combination sentences, so we can do it, for a variety. We can do it for words if they misuse a word. And so that they do get to hear.
Could you give an example?
Yeah, so for example, when children start to produce more sentence-like things, they often leave out like the past tense or something. So the child might say, I walk to school instead of I walked. And so a parent might recast and say, you walked to school. Okay, so exposing them to that. Now, they'll hear it, they won't hear it. I mean, again, these things are going to happen a lot. We know that there has to be a critical mass of recasting that they hear before it makes a difference, but they store it in their brain, and then whether, you know. So we know that recasting is something that's really important. It's one of our major clinical techniques, if you will, to use that, but children who have language impairment need to hear even more recasts. It's amazing how many they need to hear before it will actually change their knowledge. So that is useful. It's helpful for people to hear that recast the target way of producing it. On the other hand, actually saying to somebody, no, that's not the way you do it, probably is not helpful. But recasting it, in that sense, that's correcting it. And we do know that people do attend to that. I can't tell you about adult language acquisition, but I believe that is also, recasting is also helpful for adults who are trying to learn a second language.
You just only do it once.
Yeah.
No, it's
John?
When I was a kid, I had this thing that I had to have speech therapy, but I always wondered if it was really a speech issue, where if I got excited or angry or emotional or somebody's even reading, if I had to read aloud, I'd be nervous in class, I would transpose first syllables so it would become unintelligible. So if instead of saying fast car, I'd say cast far. Instead of red stairs, I'd say stead rares. You know, and it still happens to this day if I get excited or emotional.
Yeah, I was going to say, you said you did this as a kid, and I was like, really?
The cure was I had to go to this little closet in the classroom. It was literally a closet.
Yeah, often I was in the schools, and they put us in closets. That's where we would,
With the speech therapist, and they had this projector that would have text, but it would only light up one word at a time. They could control the speed, and they had to be very slow, say the word. It was a story or whatever. But is that a speech problem, or is that kind of a thinking problem?
So, you know,
because I find the older I get,
everyone does it. Everyone does it. It's actually called a spoonerism. It's called a spoonerism. There was a Reverend Spooner who used to do these things. Martin, the classic for Reverend Spooner is, "Martin me Patton, may I sew you to another sheet." That is a quote from Reverend Spooner where you do that. And it's very interesting because some people are more prone to that than others, and it probably has to do with, again, how things are stored in our brain and how you access. So I don't know that I would call it a speech or a language problem. For me, one of the things that's so interesting about that kind of phenomena, what we call speech error phenomena, is that when you make those errors, it doesn't violate your language, so that you don't end up creating words, phonetic strings that could not be words in your language. And so to me, I look at those speech errors and it shows knowledge. Right? It really shows how much you know about your native language. Whereas, of course, since you don't want that to happen, it can interfere with communication, then you might view it from a sort of the deficit perspective. So I don't think that is a language problem per se. I personally don't know how you would work to help somebody who's doing that a lot. I have never worked with anybody with that. But for me, you know, it's a fascinating phenomenon. But that's what that is. That's spoonerisms. We all do it. Just like we all have word recall problems, and we all make grammatical errors, but we don't do it a lot. And when it reaches a critical mass, and it happens more frequently and interferes with the communication, that's where we start to think that somebody might have what's called a language disorder. Yeah. So I think that we're...
Yeah, I mean, if there's any more questions, we can, Sarita's
I'm happy to...
We know where to find her.
This has been a blast. This was really been a blast. I deliberately didn't prepare a lecture because I knew that I believe my students will tell you I have no problem continuing to talk.
So I want to thank Sarita.